Caddis Maximus here, this time with a quick review and comparison of LineMan's pliers. Decided to do a comparison of just LineMan's pliers because they are, and I don't like to really use the word quintessential, but they are the heavy-duty type of plier that people would generally use. The most common pliers would be slip joint pliers like these, but LineMan's pliers tend to be the actual heavy-duty pliers, and because one, that they have cutters and they're really multi-purpose. Many LineMan's pliers actually have a variety of functions we can demonstrate. Of course, it would be having cutters. The second would be having nice, wide, heavy-duty jaws that are very strong, easily as strong as any amount of force that you can put onto the plier, and it actually makes them pretty handy. They're not actually hammers, but most LineMan's pliers, when you need to hammer something in or fold a piece of metal over, it's exactly kind of what they're designed for. They really are heavy-duty pliers. And thirdly, many LineMan's pliers have serrations such as these inside the back of the jaws. And my understanding is when you're pulling wire and you have fish tape, that you would actually use this inner jaw, you would clamp onto the fish tape, and that way you could grab with both hands and then use it as a pulling tool to pull on any kind of stubborn fish tape that you have down some conduit. We have a variety of different brands, varying levels of qualities. We have some smaller, older Heikos here. Heiko is not a name that many people heard of and won't be hearing of. They haven't been around for a while. But then we have some Stanleys, some Compounds Titans. We have some Ideals, a couple different generations of Kleins, which are, in my opinion, one of the best, if not the best. It's always hard to say really the best because there's always a few manufacturers that make really high-end stuff, but the Kleins really are tried and true, and the company's been around for a century and a half. We have an unknown brand, which is always curious because you find some tools like these which are obviously very nice, very heavy-duty, professionally made, and they just didn't stamp their name or anything on there, which is always an oddball to me. And then we have some ChannelLocks here. Now, one of the differences we'll see if we compare, say, these Ideals and the Kleins is that you have two different styles of LineMan's pliers. Well, I should say a third thing. There is a gap in the jaws. That's how you really know LineMan's pliers, and that gap is so that you can twist wires together and they don't get crushed quite as badly. So the idea would be that you would have a couple of, say, these solid core wires, which can be real tough to try to twist together with using your bare hands. And so you just use the LineMan's pliers, and just that gap just helps prevent you from damaging the wire too much. That didn't work out very well. It's because I have too short of wires, but that's kind of the idea and why they have a gap, is just specifically for wire twisting. And then you would, of course, put a wire nut on there afterwards. Now back to the comparison, you have two different styles, which would be this common style, which is standard LineMan's pliers with cutters, and then a little gap in the back of the jaw. Klein doesn't serrate the back of the jaws, but you'd use them in a similar fashion for pulling fish tape. You have this other style of LineMan's pliers, like these Ideals here. These are specifically the 3425s. These Kleins are the D2000s. And then this style has crimpers built in, which is kind of nice, and they're also really wide, so they work quite well. And then they have a large cutter, shear style cutter in the back of the jaw instead of a clamp. And so that would be generally the two different styles. Even if you go to Harbor Freight, that standard has remained. Harbor Freight's come out with their new Doyle and other higher end grade pliers, and they have both styles. They have this traditional style, and then they have the quote unquote crimping style. Now, another thing I did want to point out is many LineMan's pliers, such as these Stanleys, these Unknowns, the ChannelLocks that I have over here, they have a distinctive shape, which is this raised hump, and that's because of how they make the cutters. The cutters, they take and they use like an end mill, and they have to carve out this big section here so they can get the taper for the cutters, and so they add extra meat onto the back of the jaw to help make sure it maintains its heavy strength. And that tends to carry over as basically a tradition in many forms of LineMan's pliers. Now, slightly cheaper ones like these Stanleys don't really have the same kind of precision gap, but they're still pretty good. You can still see that they have the serrations in the back of the jaw. And with these kind of pliers like these Stanleys, I like their soft grip, and that can make it a lot easier. And I also like this strong finger stop or hand stop here, so if you're actually using the push something, it's easier to get some purchase on it and not have to worry about your hand slipping. And although linesman's pliers, like these smaller ones, are nice, and I do have them because, you know, in cold weather the insulated handles are nice, as well as the soft grip, you just don't get quite as much force. There is a deal with these linesman's pliers, as we can see, is that the handles tend to be pretty long. You want to have extra leverage because when you're cutting solid core wire such as this, and you're cutting more than one piece at the same time, even though it's copper wire, it can require quite a bit of force to actually get them to snip off. And if you're cutting thicker wire, you really want the extra leverage. If we were to compare overall quality, the Kleins, one of the reasons I say that they're the best, such as these Ideals, which are a really nice set, but we can see that I'm not squeezing very hard here, and I can really get a lot of handle deflection out of that, versus these Kleins, which are much stiffer. I have to squeeze. I'm squeezing much harder than I was on the Ideals, and they're not deflecting very much at all. Of course, Klein still makes these, and they are essentially the very same plier, although they do have different forgings. You can tell because these are an X2 forging, where these are an original forging. And Kleins are also machined the same way with the cutters, but they, instead of having the sharp hump, they just round it off. One of the other reasons I do recommend Kleins so much is this is an old pair I've had, and I pulled up a bamboo floor and probably removed 1,000 T-nails with this very set of pliers. And even though it was mild steel nails, when you remove 1,000 nails, this would be clamping onto the nail and then using a pry bar to yank it out. Or to pry it out. The jaws really just have held up just extremely well. Very high quality steel and a very hard heat treatment on the end of the jaws. And that's one reason to get Kleins, is that you can really trust the strength and quality of the steel. You can see a few different dents in the back of these. I have used these as flat out hammers and driven nails in certain situations where it was just a tool I had, and that's all that's happened is a couple little light dings. They really are one of the best. And one last thing of note about Klein tools is they have used the very same logo for their entire history, which is the guy up on a telephone pole. And if you look closely and you think it's a Klein, you'll always be able to find either that laser etching, which is real hard to see there it is, or it'll be stamped. Moving on, now DeWalt and ChannelLock and pretty much everybody has these types of pliers now, and needle nose and cutters, and of course linesman's style. These Titans I've had for a long time, and they're one of the first ones that I saw. These types of pliers are hit and miss. The reason that they're a hit is because they are compound. You get a lot of extra leverage. But one of the reasons that they're a miss is because when you have the jaws open an equivalent amount, say like this, you can see how much wider the handles are. So what you're doing is through the compound, you have to have more handle motion that's being translated into less jaw motion, giving you that leverage. And that can be an issue. And it's one of the things I wanted to point out is even though compounds are nice, you do not have anywhere near the range as a more traditional set of pliers, and in many situations it's nice to have that extra wide opening. So that would be one reason not to get compounds. The second reason is obviously when it's way out like this, it's extremely difficult to actually get any real grip. So as you start to tighten down to where you can actually get a grip on the handle of the pliers, you have very little space in the jaw. And so I found that I use these more for situations where I'm like crimping over a piece of metal, or I want the extra leverage, or I'm trying to pull something and I need a lot of extra grip, or maybe I'm cutting something pretty hard. One thing to mention about the side cutters on these pliers is they are not meant for piano wire or hardened steel wire or bolts. They're designed for soft, mild steel like tie wire and, of course, copper wire. And it's one thing, it's always frustrating to borrow or use a pair of pliers where somebody has just been cutting bolts and hard steel wire and there's just all sorts of notches and gaps and they don't really cut anymore. Definitely quite frustrating. One of the last things to note about the compound style pliers is that they use these sheet metal handles, which are pretty strong because they're still hard riveted to a solid steel head, but they're definitely not as rigid as this one-piece forged steel handles. So ultimately, they're not quite as robust, even though you do get a lot of grip force. And these type of pliers have been knocked off. I did a video of small compact pliers, and so like these Heikos here, these are just a small old set of linesman style pliers, but they tried to make them kind of universal, where they're a linesman's plier. They're kind of like a slip joint with the little serrations to drive bolts as well as the cutter. And it's just interesting to see a different take on what has been a standard type of plier. I'm not sure if Klein actually invented this style, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did. Now, getting on to the last ones here, these are actually some ChannelLocks. These are some 350Ss. Now, there are styles of linesman pliers like these, which are spring-loaded, and so some situations you don't want them spring-loaded because they're always just open like this, and they kind of are a fuss. And sometimes they're handy to have, especially if you're repeatedly pulling stuff or you're in an awkward situation where it's hard to pull them open with one hand. It's really nice sometimes to have the spring-loaded, so that's why I have these. The second thing, and Klein and many other manufacturers, is they have ones which have this little handle on them, or this little hook, so you can get extra pulling force. And that's specifically why I got these. I thought, well, they're spring-loaded, and you have this extra hook, which is just incredible. When you need to pull on something really hard, there is nothing like this hook right here. And it really has been handy in many situations. You just get a really good purchase, a really confident grip. You're not worried at all about your hand sliding off. You just have to make sure you have a good grip, and they've really been pretty amazing. Some down points of these ChannelLocks is they have pretty strong handles. I wouldn't say they're quite as thick and strong as the Kleins, but they're definitely really good. But what did surprise me is many ChannelLock tools are good, but these are undersized. I would call them more of a compact head linesman's plier. And what I mean is if we take these Kleins and we align the top of the lock rivets, we can see that the head just has less cross section. There is less steel there. Another thing to make note of is we can see that this head, if I get it real flat, is just not as thick as the Klein. And I was kind of surprised about that, and you can feel it, these are lighter weight. But I was just surprised at ChannelLock to be, I think these are a better price. I think these are like 20 bucks or 22 bucks, where a new pair of these Kleins here is like $30. To kind of meet that point, they did make them just a little bit smaller, not quite as thick, and obviously not quite as strong, because I highly doubt that there's much difference in the quality, actual raw quality of steel between the Kleins and the ChannelLocks. But I just did want to point out that even though a ChannelLock is a great brand, their linesman's pliers are just not as heavy duty as some Kleins. And if we take these, which are really extra oversized, it gets pretty dramatic. It's like these are a medium and these are a large, but these are both basically sold as being directly competing products. And so it's not like I would recommend against these ChannelLocks. They are nice, but if I had a choice and I was willing to spend an extra $5 or $10, I would get the Kleins, because the Kleins are essentially ones that you'll own for life. And the only way you'll really ruin them is if you just let them sit outside and rust to nothing, or you just ruin the side cutters. And even if you ruin the side cutters, they'll still be a useful pair of pliers, and you basically won't be able to break these unless you use, pipes on the handles and cheater bar them. And to finish up this review, there's one last thing of note, is most linesman's pliers of these style should be self-stopping. What that means is the way they're designed, when you open them up all the way, they don't get jammed. And that's one aspect, is you should be able to open them up and just have them stop and be able to close them. And many pliers, they'll be designed kind of oddly, where they won't stop and they'll kind of get stuck when you open them all the way. And even ones that aren't obvious, like these Kleins, when they come around, they end up stopping right there. And that's kind of one big aspect, is some really cheap ones, when you open them all the way, they'll end up getting stuck. You'll open them up and then they'll kind of get jammed in that open position, and then you'll have to fiddle to get them to get past that stuck point and then be able to actually clamp them. So good ones would be able to open all the way and shut all the way without having any worries about them kind of getting stuck or jammed up. Anyway, I just wanted to do a quick review and comparison and discussion of LineMan's pliers, and just kind of showing some different points and aspects to them, and how really a pair of LineMan's pliers or heavy-duty pliers isn't the same as any other. And you have to evaluate, what you're going to use them for. And if you really want to have some pliers that are going to be extra reliable, then you definitely want to spend a little bit more money and get more of a professional grade. And things like compounds, even though there's certain situations which they are handy, in most situations when you're actually using them to grip stuff and work with them, you'll end up finding lots of frustration because it's hard to grip the handles when they flip open so wide. And you'll find situations where the jaws just don't open quite wide enough for whatever you're trying to use them for. And in those situations, they become essentially useless and are, harmful almost. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching. And please subscribe. Catus Maximus out.